An anonymous narrator recalls a Christmas Eve gathering at an old house where guests listen to one another ghost stories. A guest named Douglas introduced a story that involves two children, Flora and Miles, and his sister, Governess, with whom he was in love. After perusing the governess written record of the events from his home, he provides a few introductory details. A handsome bachelor persuaded the government to take the position as a government for his niece and nephews, isolated to a country home after the previous governess died. Douglas began to read from the written record, and the story shifts to the government's point of view as she narrates her strange experience. So without further hesitate, this poet basically came from this book that I was about reading it. It was basically based in Christmas. Christmas happens again. But this time we're taking in another different story. Last year we basically read the stories about Ebenezer Scrooge's dark stories, how he turned out. So this is The Return of a Screw, and its director, Henry James. The governess narrative opens with her drive to Bali, a country home in Essex, and a country in eastern England. Here she meets the housekeeper, Miss Gross, and the younger of her two charges, Flora, an exceptionally beautiful and a charming little girl. From her room, the governess thinks she hears the footsteps and the crying of a child in the distance, but dismisses them. Optimistic about the opportunity to teach and shape her beautiful charge. Taking with Mr. Gross, the governess asks about the Flora's brother, Mrs. Gross, emphasize the boy's good looks. And the governess remarks impulsively upon her employee handsomeness. Mrs. Grouse tells the governess that Flora's brother will arrive on Friday, at which the governess decided that she and Flora will meet him together. She spends the entire next day with Flora, who shows the new governess her home with delight. Summing up her feelings in retrospect, the governess expresses her an optimistic attitude towards her new position in contact to her present feeling towards ballet as ugly, a drafting ship of which she herself was at the helm. By the time we finished the prologue beginning the governess narrative, we knew that the story to come is a ghost story, and it involves a governess who is in love with her employer ordinarily. Given the basic story, per me, we would expect the story to be the gothic romance and to have an unrealistic plot, primarily in a sense that it would contain supernatural elements, but also in the idea that the governess might aspire to rise above her station and win the love of the rich gentleman. Something that happened in Gothic romantics, such as Jane Eyre, but not in real life. In other words, to read a story like this, we would normally be prepared to put aside our arcanism about whether these events could actually happen, would simply enjoy the story. The main function of the prologue, however, is to tell us not to do this. The prologue depicts an audience for the governess story that is adult, worldly, and sional rather than a native semental. The narrator makes it clear that some of the guests are more sophisticated than others, that those who remains to hear Douglas's story are a select group. This group is characteristic of such arc, meaning deliberate and even focusing ironic and playful. The group's members are fairly aggressive about reading between the lines about what Douglas says to draw sexual interference, as Mrs. Griffin does about Douglas and the governess. The guests who wisecrack about the foreigner governess dying of so much respectfully is insinuating that the former governess is less than respectable, perhaps morality and sexually loose. This sketch treats Douglas' story skeptically, even silently, refusing to take things at the face of volume and ready to make inference of a sexual nature. When we learn more about this form of governance, Miss Joensel, to see that this guess absolutely right and perhaps conclude that we intended it to read the turn of the screw in the same way, viewing the characteristic realistically, rather than romantically, treating the story skeptically and reading between the lines with sexual overtones. From the first sentence of her narrative in chapter 1, the governess calls attention to her own sharp swigs and moods and attitudes, a focus that makes her seem sensitive, emotional, nervous, and introspect, but not necessarily relatable. Her prescriptions that things at Bailey are clearly shaped by her emotions and her imagination. Often her judgments seems to excessively hasty or intense. Her reaction to Flora in particular seems excessive, as she describes Flora in such idolized terms, radiant and beautic. But that when we get a little sense of Flora as a real child, the governess feels affections of Mr. Grouse, but her feelings often change quickly, though briefly, to suspicion. The governess reports hearing footsteps and crying outside her room, and she gets a sense that Mrs. Grouse is too glad to see her, both of which provides foreshadowing and create a sense that something is going on that we have yet to learn about. However, the government's sensibly and violently also creates a feeling of uncertainty about whether we can trust your point of view. The question is one current problem of the turn of the screw, and it develops and deepens rather than resolves. Together with Flora, the governess drives out to meet Miles. The governess is unsettled by a letter from her employer that came in the mail on her first day. Enclosed was another letter, the Miles headmaster, saying that Miles is no longer welcome at school. Distressed by the thought that Miles might be a troublemaker and the knowledge that she has agreed to lend to matters herself, she questions Mr. Gross. Her companion, as distressed as she, seems not to understand why Miles had been turned out from school. The governess later that day approaches her colleague again, asking Mr. Gross if she ever known Miles to cause trouble. Mrs. Gross implies that Miles had, on occasion, been bad, but that he was to expect it from a boy. A few hours before leaving to meet Miles, a governess approaches Mrs. Gross once more, questioning her about the previous governess. Miss Gross describes her as a young and pretty, but as a slave, about her death, claiming she does not know why the young woman died. The governess is late picking up Miles, whom she finds standing outside the inn exuding the same beauty and purity as Flora. Joining Mrs. Gross back at bay, the government rejects on the basis of Miles' attractive appearance any charges she or the headmasters may have made against Miles. She determines to do nothing in regards to Miles' expulsions. Mrs. Gross says she will stand by the direct decision that the two kiss and embrace. The government soon became absorbed in her responsibilities, and her two pupils gave her little, if any, trouble. During her private hour one evening, the governess takes a walk around the grounds, fascinated unrealistically about meeting her master. And when she comes back into view of the house, she sees a strange man standing atop one of the house's tower, looking at her. The governess experiences a stillness, a sudden hush. Her confrontation with the man lasts a long, intense moment before he passes from one of the tower's corner to the other. In retrospect, the government remembered that the man turned away from her without ever breaking his stare. Confused, the government wonders what sort of mystery by my hold. Meeting Mrs. Gross at the house, she points to the evening's beauty as her reason for staying out so late. For days, the government reflects on her encounter with the intruder. Meanwhile, her time spent with Miles and Flora goes smoothly. Still wondering about the cause of the boy's expulsion, she decides finally that he was too refined to the horrid, unclean school world and had been punished for it. As much of a government enjoys her charges, she is concerned that both children are impersonal, seemingly without history. One Sunday, the government came down the stairs to meet Mrs. Gross for church, only to meet a disturbing visage at the window. It is the intruder from the tower staring intensely at her from outside the dining room window. The governess runs outside and confronts the man, but he was vanished. She turns to the window to stand where he had stood at the moment Mrs. Gross enters the dining room and is startled by the image of the governess staring in from outside. Mrs. Gross, breathless, asks the governess why she looks so frightened. The governess responds by saying she cannot go to church and claims that what Mrs. Gross saw was not half as bad as what she herself saw just a few minutes ago. She then bewilders and frightens her colleague by detailing her experience with an intruder at the window and earlier at the tower, calling a man a horror. The government tells Mrs. Gross that she feels compelled to stay and watch their home instead of going to church. Mrs. Gross asks what the man looked like, and the governess describes him without a hat, with very red hair and a pale face. Mrs. Gross suddenly makes an expression of recognition of the name was the intruder is Peter Quilt, her employer, former valet. At the government's were questioning, Mrs. Gross reveals that Quint was in charge of Bailey's last year until his death.